Okay, let's begin. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Bukit Timah campus of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, and welcome to this Festival of Ideas. This is one of the two opening sessions for the festival. The festival is a week-long event that the Lee Kuan Yew School organizes every other year. The purpose of the festival is that it is an engagement with the local community here in the Bukit Timah area, but in Singapore more broadly, and indeed an engagement with the rest of the world. At the festival, we welcome students from neighborhood JCs, at the same time that we welcome world-renowned academics and thought leaders from all around the world. The festival is an engagement on the great ideas and the most pressing issues of our time. It is an occasion where the school gets to showcase our thinking. Our PhD and master's students display their work. Our faculty and colleagues, both from the school itself, but our colleagues from all around the world, engage in conversation. This is all part of the school mission, that we inspire change makers and leadership. We help improve the well-being of people around us and further afield. And we help transform Asia through the experience of good governance. The session here this morning is about the China shock at the end of history. What we will do is we will have a series of opening statements from four of us, and then after that, we will engage in conversation, both among the four of us and with you, the audience. I will not repeat information that you already have in brochures and that brought you here, but I would now just like to welcome to the stage Professor Chan Heng Chi, Professor Selina Ho, Mr. Li Xian. Please join me in welcoming my colleagues to the stage. We will begin in alphabetical order with a short opening statement from each of the panelists on this that we're going through, the US-China rivalry and what we do with it going forwards. Ambassador Professor Chan, please.
Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I hope I will be short. I don't know. I'm a little disorganized, but we've had 3 China shocks since the end of history. That is, since the end of the Cold War. The first shock is a rapid and relentless rise of China, especially since its entry into WTO. Economically, first for China, because it brought about great transformation, and it also had great geopolitical and geo-economic implications for the rest of the world. I think the United States and Europe never foresaw what the rise of China would mean in terms of China being the factory of the world. It was good for everybody until it wasn't good for everybody. Napoleon said of China, "Let China sleep, for when she wakes, she will shake the world." And Lee Kuan Yew, in fact, I looked at one of his old tapes in 1980 at a Fullerton Square rally, said, of China, and this is 1980, 2 years after China's entry into the world, the 4 modernizations, etc., and Deng Xiaoping's visit to Singapore. He saw what was happening in Shenzhen, and he said, "Look at Shenzhen, what the Chinese are doing. Just watch it grow." Then he also said in the same speech, China is today buying Boeings from the United States and Tridents from Britain. In 2 to 3 generations, China will be building its own planes. One generation is about 25 years or 20 years. So in 40, 50 years, China will be building its own plane. Absolutely correct. You've just seen the C919 being unveiled. So that is the China shock. But let me put it again in another way, the first shock. Do you know in 1980, that's 2 years just after modernization, so it doesn't count, China is finding its way through, its share of the world GDP was 2.7%. In 2001, I take it 1 year after WTO, its share of the world economy was 3.9%. United States was 31.3%, Europe 21.3%, Japan 13.9%. In 2023, and this includes some of the problems China has been going through, China's share of the world economy was 16.9%. America, from 31% in 2001, has become, in 2023, 26.1%. Europe is 17.5%, dropped also, and Japan is 4% of the world's economy. China and Europe as a whole, China as a single economy, vies for second place as share of the world economy, and in recent years, because of what's happening in China with the difficulties, I think its share of the world economy is dropped some. So United States is sitting pretty at about 25, 26%. So that's what it means. It's that shock from 2.7% in 1980 to now about 17% of the world economy. There are other figures I can give you, the share of the trading economy, but I don't have time. The second shock that China delivered was that China's rise triggered an intense competition between the United States and China, not seen since the end of the Cold War. Clearly, it is about dominance in the world order. First, it began as a trade war, then it was investment war, then it was a technology war, military competition and so on. As George Yeo said, very soon it'll be a hot war, but it's different wars. But it's about dominance in the world system. And it is about values, and it is about soft power. And recently, in the last year or so, it's been more clear who sets the rules of the world order. Now, this is structural. And so this rivalry, this competition will not end anytime soon. And it will not end no matter whether the United States votes for Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. It's whether it's a little bit more predictable or totally unpredictable. Those who say China should have stuck to peaceful rise, I say, are wrong. Because even if they said, China said, we believe in peaceful rise, nobody will believe China. In fact, when I was in the United States in the 1990s, early 2000s, Americans said to me, oh yeah, they say peaceful rise, this is stage one. Wait till China gets stronger. Will they still stick to peaceful rise? So there's no point, They can't hide the light under the bushel. They cannot say they believe in peaceful rise. Shock number 3 is the rapid slide and difficulties of the Chinese economy. We've seen China grow so rapidly. So in the last few years, when we saw China's economy spluttering, doing so badly, that's a shock too. Goodness, is this China? And in America, there are analysts who say, China peak, China peak. China is going to slide and go down from now on. So what is the real China? So this is the third shock that China has developed, that it can rise so fast and suddenly things seem to unravel so quickly. And on top of it, we hear about its declining population and the aging population. Mind you, the whole world is aging and the whole world is declining. Demographers said in 2080, world's population would have peaked. All of us would have declining populations. So it's not just China with a declining population. But I think the declining population, aging population, with the slowing economy presents challenges for investors and for China. So how do you read China? Is it completely failing? If you read Financial Times, New York Times these days, there's no good news that comes out of China. But let me tell you that there are some reports which very few pick up, and when they do, it just floats away. And that is that first-tier cities in China are in trouble. Second, third, fourth, fifth-tier cities in China are doing quite okay. You know, not all cities, but many of the cities are doing okay. Now, I have some data from Think China, which is the Zhao Bao's publication on China. And it shows that retail sales in these second, third tier cities are rising, you know. Not all, but most of them. If you take 36 cities, 3 are falling behind, the rest are going up. Tier 2, Tier 3. I have the figures here. The reference, if you want, is 9th of September 2024 for scholars here. That's your reference, Think China, look up the data, you know. And also, the growth is not bad. And further, if you say, oh, Think China, Lian He is pro-China, let me cite you Economist data. The Economist on June 6, 2024, had an issue which was, you know, move over Beijing, you know, watch out for the second and third tier cities. But you see, it came as one article and nobody put things together. But I've no time, Danny. I just came across this yesterday and I was too lazy to put it into a slide, you know. But the economies of the second and third tier cities are generally, the figures show they are growing. Hefei, Changsha, Chongqing, they all are near 7.78% growth in these cities. Hefei, Changsha, Chongqing, Nanjing is like 6.5, Chengdu, Shenzhen, okay? But Beijing and Shanghai, Guangzhou, is below the national average. Not Guangdong, but Beijing and Shanghai, okay? And the population changes. Population is growing in Chengdu, Xi'an, Wuhan, Changsha, Hefei, Nanjing, Hangzhou, Shenzhen, so on. Beijing losing population, Chongqing kind of stopped, and Shanghai just 0.06. So things are moving to the second, third tier cities, some movement there. And it makes sense because China's now growth model emphasizes advanced manufacturing and the green economy. And a lot of this is going out to the second and third tier cities, so that's where people are going. Also, the Think China article says that people are spending in the second and third tier cities because in tier one, all the property, tier one cities, money is tied up in property. And it's so high, then it collapsed. And you have your tech entrepreneurship, the tech talent, financial talent, etc. They are so tied up. And all these sad stories, Tanping and so on, people are going to the first-tier cities and getting most of the feedback there. But this doesn't mean China is sort of booming like that. And some skeptics say, can the advanced manufacturing, AI, etc., and green economy replace or create the same growth as the infrastructure, property, infrastructure, etc. of the past, e-commerce? Probably not. So it's slowing down a bit, but it's not flat and not growing. This is China. So what I'm trying to say is that there is another narrative, and we should look at this. China is not a hopeless case, and it's changing. Clearly, the model is changing. So I do not know what will come at the end of it. I better wind up soon because I'm exceeding my time. So the question is, one, will China recover? Two, if China's economy is weakening, does that lighten the competition between the United States and China? I, for one, don't think so, because there are some people saying in the US, well, if it's down, why don't you put it out, you know? So you strengthen and put China 5-10 years behind. So the question is, are we moving to a decoupled world? Is this going to be a Cold War? I'll leave Selina to talk about that. But I think we have to remember, I have always said the United States is a resilient country. Don't underestimate the United States. In the same way, I will say China is a resilient country. Don't underestimate China. And when China's growth picks up again, you will find people flocking back to Hong Kong and flocking back to China, because the world, Europe and China and the United States does not want to miss out on a piece of the action. So what is the role of small and medium-sized states in this contentious time? I would say we can do nothing if the United States does not themselves see that it is not in their interest to go to war. If the United States and China feel it is not in their interest to go to war, small states, medium-sized states can do something. And we are all trying, building bridges, creating forums for track 2 conferences, and there's a lot of that going on now. And since the San Francisco summit, Americans say there's a floor put to how low the relationship can fall. You ask Americans, they say, relationship has stabilized. I've spoken to the Chinese counterparts, and they say, relationship has stabilized. I think they hope it will stabilize, you know. And Jake Sullivan has said, Now, in Bali, President Xi Jinping told President Biden, that China does not seek to change the existing, interfere in the internal affairs of the US, and has no intention to challenge or displace the United States. This was repeated in San Francisco as well. The United States does not believe in the statement at all. So I think there will be this pushing back and forth. We should work in small bites of time, I would say. Small little forums. You cannot have a strategy and a plan for a decade how you bring US, because confidence building is a step-by-step measure. And even then, this is hard. My last point is that whilst we can build a bridge, you are seeing a number of countries emerging, what I call countries that are entering a third space. India is one of them. And Indonesia, I think Singapore tries, where you want to have good relationships all around. You can have alignment. India has alignment on the Quad Indo-Pacific strategy, but it is not exclusive. It still has a relationship with Russia. So this third space, when it grows, I think will help to blunt the rivalry between the two sides. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heng Chi, for such an excellent opening to our session. You talked about the 3 shocks, you talked about geographical rebalancing in China, and then you gave us some optimism on a way ahead with a very nuanced, subtle discussion about possible strategies. I'd now like to invite Professor Selina Ho to pick up the conversation.
Thank you very much. Can I speak from here?
Yeah, absolutely. I plan to.
Great. Thanks, Daddy, and thank you for being here. And it's a real pleasure to be on this panel, and a real honor too. I'm glad that I'm actually speaking right after Ambassador Chan, because a lot of her remarks resonate with me, but also because I want to, she addresses the systemic or the structural view as we know it in US-China rivalry. What I really want is to look at the domestic drivers. And in particular, I'm interested in the Chinese angle. So I'm going to talk about the Chinese perspective of this rivalry. The title is The China Shock at the End of History, so rightfully speaking about China is correct. I think that Ambassador Chan takes gave a very good dissecting of the China shock, the three shocks. But let me speak a little bit about the end of history. And I have some students in the audience. If I were in a classroom, I'll be dissecting and unpacking these terms, right? Now, the end of history, some of you may or may not know about it, and it's been used quite a lot in different circles. But the end of history is actually popularized by a book that Francis Fukuyama wrote. It's in 1992, right after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of communism in Europe. So it was called The End of History and the Last Man. Now, this idea, the end of history, actually did not come from Fukuyama himself. He popularized it. But it's an idea, that concept that has been put out there by Western philosophers, and in particular, German philosopher Hegel. Okay? Now, the idea of the end of history is not the end of the world. Just to be clear, it's different from the end of the world. It's the end of history in the sense that human progression is such that at the end of history, there will be a political system or ideology that will prevail. So that's the background to the title of China Shock at the end of history, which is a very fantastic idea that you came up with, Danny, by the way. I really like it. And we can discuss the end of history, the merits of Fukuyama's, or dismerits of his arguments later on in discussion. But let me quickly dive into my remarks. And my remarks are actually organized around three main questions. The first question is, what are the drivers of Chinese foreign policy? Second question is, what is the kind of international order or world order that China wants? And what does this Chinese ambitions, what are these ambitions, and what Chinese ambitions and the US reluctance to acquiesce to Chinese ambitions, what does this mean for the rest of us, for the rest of the world, and for our future? Okay, so let me look at the first question, drivers of Chinese foreign policy. Now, one of the key, I think, misunderstandings and misperception and the lack of this communication between China and the US is that sometimes I think they don't understand the domestic politics of the other side very well. And we actually really need to understand this rivalry in a sense that looking at within China itself. We need to search for these drivers within China. Now, by asking this very first question, what are Chinese domestic priorities? And I think when President Xi and when he came into office in 2012, 2013, he came into office looking at society, economy, and the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, and the direction it's going. And I think they saw something which he's not very happy with, and the group around him, they are not very happy with. So he had three remakes. He wanted to remake three things. The first is to remake Chinese economy. Now, what does that mean? Well, China does not like a freewheeling economy that's completely driven by market forces. I think they recognize the need for market forces, but they don't want it to be completely driven by market forces. It does not like the uneven development and the inequalities that come with this market forces. And so they don't look at the West, they look at the West and they say, this is not what we want. We don't want these inequalities, we don't want this uneven development. We want something more stable, more equal, and hence we have the term common prosperity. Okay, so this is why, in a sense, you see the Xi government and those around him targeting private businesses and firms that have gotten too big and powerful. So they want to control these businesses so that it becomes so powerful that they will challenge the Chinese Communist Party or the Chinese state. I think that's a key point. And China wants, the other thing in economy is a dual circulation economy. That's the other thing that you hear very often. Now, what does that mean? It means really a closing off of the Chinese economy, but more importantly, the desire for self-reliance. And I think this desire for self-reliance it predates the trade war in 2016. It predates the US-China rivalry trade war in 2016. And so we need to understand the first domestic priority is to remake Chinese economy. The second priority is to remake Chinese society. Again, the Xi leadership and his team came into power and saw a society that he thinks is deteriorating, a society that is not ideologically pure enough. It wanted to keep out Western thought. It wanted to keep out ideas, liberal ideas, capitalist ideas, and bring ideological purity back. And in a sense, you have things like social rebalancing that's being used here. And the social credit system. Now, why do we have that? Well, essentially, it's to control society. And the Chinese have really been very good in controlling society through the use of technology. And that's pretty amazing in the way that they have wielded that. But basically, it created a walled-off society from the rest of the world to keep out the elements that the Chinese leadership does not want. Now, the third remake that the Chinese Communist Party have is to remake the CCP itself. Again, the sense is that the CCP has lost its way. It's lost its ideological purity, its fervor, and has gone too far in the liberal way, in the Western sense, right? So you have all these anti-corruption campaigns, ideological correctness, the stress on ideological correct thought. So these three remakes. Now, why these three remakes? Why these priorities? Essentially, it boils down to one thing, and that is to enhance the legitimacy, ensure the survival of the CCP regime. This need to enhance legitimacy and the survival of the regime and the party drives Chinese foreign policy. So Chinese foreign policy goals, essentially, in a very broad scheme of things, is to ensure two things: to ensure the legitimacy of the CCP and to make the world safe for different forms of government, and not just democratic governments, but make the world safe also for authoritarian or autocratic governments. Now, that's the first answer to the first question. Now, the second question is, what kind of world order does China want? Now, China has, in my opinion, a hierarchical worldview. It sees great powers as ruling the world and jointly managing the world. We call this great power management, great powers managing the world. And hence, you see President Xi proposing the idea of a G2, right? A G2 with the United States during the Obama administration. That idea has flown out of the window by now. But the idea is that the two greatest powers, the United States and China, leading the rest of the world and managing affairs, right? So what it really wants at the end of the day is really parity with China. It wants its authority to be recognized as legitimate. It wants a world order where it has greater say, and it wants a world order that's commensurate with its size. Now, its key grievance is that the United States and its allies have not accorded it the status, the respect, and the position it's entitled to because its political system and ideology are different. This is its key grievance, okay? Now, I actually, unlike Ambassador Chan, I don't think that China wants global dominance, and I'm not sure whether that's what you meant. But I agree, there is this fight for global dominance, but I'm not sure that China itself really wants global dominance. I think that China does not seek to overturn the international order. It wants to be adjusted to accommodate its rise, and it be recognized as an equal of the US. This is the idea of parity. To make it safe for authoritarian systems to be accepted, it wants recognition that the CCP is legitimate and has a right to exist and to govern China. So whether it wants global dominance is really a very big question. I think it knows it's not quite there yet. Not yet, okay? It may want parity now with the US and to have this idea of a G2 maybe in the next 10 to 20 years. But what happens after that? That's the question mark. Who knows, right? And I think in order to understand where China is going in terms of its global ambitions, it's very important to look at the developments in domestic politics. So any person who studies Chinese foreign policy, US-China rivalry, needs to look at Chinese domestic politics. Now, that's the difficult part. Understanding and trying to see what's going on in Chinese domestic politics is very difficult now because the system has become even more opaque than before. Regionally, right, what is it that China wants? And I think this is where China would want regional dominance. And by that, what I mean is that its preference is that there are no other competing centers of power in Asia, okay? Now, just to be very clear, this is what all great powers do. This is not unique to China. China wants a region where it can dominate. That is not unique to China. All great powers do that. You see that United States doing that in Latin America. You see Russia doing that in Europe, Eastern Europe. And you see India doing that in South Asia. It is a very normal behavior that great powers do. So all great powers want what is called a sphere of influence in the region. It is in or is closest to, so that its interests are not negatively impacted by a rival power. It wants the region to take into account its interests and preferences and not take the side of a rival when making policies. So this brings me to my third question. What do all these developments, Chinese ambitions and US, resistance to and reluctance to acquiesce what China wants? The US does not want to acknowledge China's status and the right of the CCP to exist and having an alternative form of government. What I want to say is that we are actually unlikely to see a return to the old Cold War. The old Cold War, right? Where alliances and blocs are really clear-cut. You know who is in whose camp. There are no in-betweens, okay? So, there's a group, the non-aligned movement, that tried to do that, but invariably, they usually slant to one side or another. Now, in a way, this alliances and blocs being clear-cut actually produce order and stability because we know exactly where each other stand. But instead, we are likely to see alliances and partnerships that are fluid because regional states, including US allies, have deep economic linkages with China. Now, the fluidity of this emerging order and shifting alliances mean there's more uncertainty and dangers as misperceptions and miscalculations may result. So are we in a new Cold War? Well, I think the jury is out on that. There's no clear answer. There are similarities, there are differences. But if there is a new Cold War, it would be different from the old. It cannot be that in the world now, and we can see that, the US and China need to talk to each other. There's a time where they didn't speak much, but they have to eventually in San Francisco and thereafter. So it would be difficult for the US and China not to talk to each other, as in the days of the Iron Curtain. A Cold War literally means, you don't talk to each other, right? So you're unlikely to see that kind of return to the old Cold War, but we may have something new on that. Now, let me end on a brighter note, and actually in agreement with Ambassador Chan's last point on small and middle powers. Now, small and middle powers can provide the ballast as great powers. They can go fight it out, but we can provide the ballast, okay? Small and middle powers have come together to ensure global supply chain stability, setting rules in technology, and many other things that we've done in digital, economic partnerships, et cetera, et cetera. I think that we are trying our best, and we should continue doing so. Thank you.
Thank you, Selena, for a wonderfully stated position. You told us about what drives China from inside, what China wants, the contours of what China's vision of an order is, and how that is consistent with and not consistent with what great powers like the United States envision. And then you told us about some hopeful ways forward as well in terms of what small and middle powers can do. You've told us about your view of what will likely emerge. Thank you very much. I'd now like to turn to Mr. Lee, who will share with us his perspective, I think from a lifetime of work in government and a lifetime of work in actually engaging with China. Mr. Lee, over to you, please.
Thank you very much. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good morning, everyone, and it's a great pleasure for me to join you in this panel discussion. If Danny had told me who will be among the audience, I may have a second thought about accepting this invitation because there are so many experts and analysts of China in this room. I speak as a student of China. I started my learning journey when I was posted to Suzhou Industrial Park in 1997. So it's almost 30 years of visiting China. And this year alone, I visited China 9th time, as I told NL. So in a week's time, I'll do my 10th trip. So I deal with government leaders, the businesses, and can be divided into the state-owned enterprises, as well as the privately owned enterprises, POEs. So I deal with them both in Singapore and in China. So I will speak from that experience or that limitation, in terms of my perspective. My remarks will be three parts. First is about China becoming the second largest economy in 2010. We all know that China started its reform and opening up in 1979. In fact, in 2018, when I spoke at the 40th anniversary of Chinese reform and opening up, I said that China was the most remarkable economic history. They had the most remarkable economic development in human history. I don't think you can find another parallel. So I think in the 80s, it grew 9.7%. In the 90s, it grew 10.5%. And in the 2000s, it grew another 10.5%. Although slowing down in the 2010s with 7%. But still, spectacular growth rates in that 40 years. So when I went to Suzhou in 1997 from the United States, I spent 5 years before that, I said, wow, capitalist economy in the world. You ain't see anything yet until you go to China. At that time, China is quite like free for all. So long you have an idea and the law doesn't say no, you can do it. So for those of you who watch the drama Fan Hua, right, it's exactly that kind of animal-spirited energy being mobilized in all levels of the society. So, of course, in that 40 years, I think the key drivers were really the reform and opening up. I think a lot of us know that how Singapore got involved when then PM Lee Kuan Yew visited China in 1976 and Deng Xiaoping came in 1978. And subsequently, Goh Keng Swee, the Prime Minister then, was appointed after he stepped down to the State Council as the economic advisor to advise on two things, special economic zones and tourism development. So in that 40 years, China had done a lot of reform and it's freed up. And people exercised the ingenuity, and creativity, and resourcefulness. And the system allowed it. So you hear the phrase that to get rich, to get wealthy is glorious. So that was really a golden period. So back and forth, I experienced that kind of energy in my work, from both as a civil servant and then later on in the politics, and then later on in the private sector. Another driver then was also the accession of China to WTO in 2001. So interestingly, I was also appointed to be the advisor of Shanghai WTO Affairs Council or something in that year. So while all of us outside China worried about how Chinese cheap products may be dumped into our markets, and then therefore killing our SMEs. In China, it's the other way around. They are all worried about foreign products, high quality, coming in and destroy their private sector. So it's a very interesting experience. But the rest is history. I think China became the factory of the world, with the largest and most extensive manufacturing capabilities. I think those of you who use Apple phone will know that that exemplifies the strength and comprehensiveness of Chinese supply chain. So then we go on to the second period. If you look closer, from 2000 to 2023, which is last year, I think in this period, China and ASEAN and Southeast Asia has gone closer in terms of economic and trade. In terms of investments, many Chinese companies have started to relocate their labor-intensive industry into, say, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Indonesia, Malaysia, and so on, because to take advantage of the relatively cheaper labor cost. So it goes with very simple household goods, furniture, clothing, textiles, and then later on followed by assembly of white goods. Another reason is also that ASEAN enjoys tariffs than the rest of the world. So by relocating some of their production Chinese-owned companies' production to ASEAN, they enjoy the differential in terms of tariff rates to say United States, North American market. The other driver during this period, 2000 and 2023, is also the Chinese plus one strategy from multinationals. And this became very pronounced after COVID, after what multinationals saw, what happened to China especially in Shanghai, after the total lockdown. So companies are saying, we no longer can put all our supply chain in one place. We better diversify our risks. And multinationals are telling their suppliers, and some of their suppliers are Chinese companies, to say that, hey, look, if you don't diversify away from China, I'm not going to give you, I'm only give you 50% of the order for next year, or 70% or whatever. So that China's plus one strategy benefited ASEAN. And you read from various reports that Vietnam is a key beneficiary, but it's not just Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, Cambodia, to a certain extent Laos and so on. Of course, behind all this, there always have been a kind of Belt and Road initiative, when China wanted to export their infrastructure building know-how to not just ASEAN countries, but to the world. So the stages of development, they really need a lot of infrastructure. Many countries are without port, without power plants, without proper road, without rail and so on. And these are all key ingredients for sustainable economic development. So China fits into that role very well. And by the way, when BRI money goes out from China to the rest of the world, Singapore managed to capture about 1/3 of the capital flow, so which is good for us. The third point I'd like to make is about these long-term prospects for China-ASEAN relations. I think Ying Chi and Selina both talk about Sino-US relations. There's a very big picture. But closer to home, I'm very interested in how Singapore and ASEAN with China will continue to develop our relations. I think the first point is ASEAN has become the largest trading partner, overtaking America and the EU 2 years ago for China. So that's very significant. China became the largest trading partner to ASEAN was history, right? I mean, not just ASEAN, but 130 other countries in the world. But for ASEAN to be the largest trading partner to China is very significant. And I think this trend will continue, notwithstanding the fact that China economies has slowed. Why? Because we have these complementarities between the two regions. ASEAN per capita income is from 1,005 US to 85,000 in Singapore. So there's a whole range. And China is about 13,000 US, so above 2/3 of ASEAN countries. So as far as China is concerned, they don't compete with ASEAN, countries per se that much. In fact, in many areas, they are leading in terms of technology and supply chain. But given the fact that the world is bifurcating and the markets are setting up protectionist policy, so the Chinese enterprise themselves, not just multinationals, will have to find ways to distribute their supply chain outside China in order to continue to survive. So 2 months ago, I received a delegation of the Home Furnishing Association from China. So I remember the president of the association said that you either go out or you die, all right? So 你不出海就要出局. This is it rhymes better in Chinese, meaning that you don't, because for that industry, they are tied to the property market, right? So their order book is suddenly reduced by 50%. And then how? I mean, so many suppliers, home furnishing, there's a lot of, related industry in the ecosystem. So if they don't go out, they will die. So that's how severe it is. So they come out, and Singapore will benefit from it because we can't do the low-cost manufacturing, but we can become the headquarter for them. Marshalling resources and becoming a command center, so to speak. The others is also, of course, as Hing Chi and Selina said before, that the geopolitical dynamics will start to drive many businesses to think ASEAN, provided ASEAN ourselves remain neutral, friendly to all parties, and acceptable to all parties. So I think I personally feel that China is really a long-term factor. After all, it's like Hing Chi said, it's 60% of the world economy. It is at your doorstep. It is 3.5 hours away from the nearest point of entry. Unlike the US, which is like 14 hours away to across the Pacific. So it's there. In fact, all of us will feel it because we see a lot more Chinese restaurants, right? Of different regional cuisine kind of emphasis in Singapore on the streets. Right? You see Chinese brands coming in, fashion brands, sports brands. And if you go to China, now they are Chinese cosmetics. Their advertisement is just as slick as any French and Japanese. Sephora reported the closing stores in China. So I think the Chinese brands will all come out. So if you ask me, how do I look at the world? But in Singapore, we are so small. We can't influence world events. We can't influence the world powers. We can have dialogues and we can be a platform. But they too will want to have their own platforms and dialogue channels. So there's a Chinese saying, in this case, it's a bit like 逆来顺受, 水来土淹, 兵来将挡, 顺势而为, correct? So meaning we can't work against the current. We just have to flow with the current. Sounds a bit Taoist, but and we find calmness and peace in this flow, and try to make a living out of it. So that's my comment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Lee, for wonderfully bringing us back to how ASEAN engages with China and how, what the prospects and challenges are going forward. I'm now going to speak about, I'm going to try and add to the conversation, and perhaps in an unexpected way. We have heard what China's priorities are. We've heard what the perspectives of China are. We've heard how ASEAN looks at this. Let me argue for the United States. Now, recently I wrote something called How America Should Stop Its Obsession of Being Number One. And for that, I got trolled tremendously by many me now anti-American. I am not, and I want to argue the case now from the perspective of the United States, because part of trying to think about the China shock is trying to think about US-China rivalry, and it takes two to tango. There's no sound of one hand clapping. We've got to try and understand both sides to this engagement. Many of you will recall that one way that many people think about US-China rivalry is through a very simple graph. That graph is one of America's GDP and of China's GDP, the size of America's economy and the size of China's economy. And all of us are now familiar with the idea how China's economy is catching up, converging towards the United States. And if you don't want to think about the economy, you can think about it in terms of the size of the military, number of nuclear warheads. You can think about it as measures of other kinds of power, engagement with the rest of the world. Every single dimension, China is catching up to the United States. What's so wrong about that? Well, from America's perspective, what's happening with this graph is the possibility of a hostile hegemonic power gaining ascendancy in the US, in the Asia-Pacific region, in the Pacific Ocean region. This now, China, the United States, Europe, everyone in the world, this part of the world, is considered the economic and soon to be potentially the political center of the world, from sheer numbers of people, from demography, from the economic vitality, from the political engagements that are happening here. When that happens, this will severely constrain American freedom of actions and the range of strategies they are able to undertake. So observers look to some imagined theoretical point. There's a threshold and say that's the danger point when China reaches 80% of US power or 90% or whatever. That's a simple story about the China shock at the end of history. China's rise has brought this upon itself. As the ambassador says, no one believes in the Zheng Bijuan's articulation of China's peaceful rise. The structure of it is that this will be a challenge. So as much as anyone else, I like simple stories to understand the world, and that is a really simple story. Size of the whatever compared to one another. But even I find that story a little bit too simple as a way to think about the China shock at the end of history, as a way to think about US-China rivalry. So let me take the 3.5 minutes I have left here to go through 3 points. Those 3 points are very simple. I want to talk about a cycle in world history. The first point I want to make is the rising part of that cycle, which you can think about as engagement of the rest of the world, of America, with China. And then I want to talk about not peak China. I'm not a pessimist about China. I think China's economy will continue to grow. But a peak of that cycle that then takes us towards disengagement, what international relations scholars call balancing, what the rest of us might think of as rivalry. This is the era, this downturn of the cycle, that's the era of the China shock. That China shock has brought us to where we are today. And then my third point, what is the way forwards for us? As all of my colleagues on this panel have said, they've all given you a vision of the way forwards. I want to give you a vision of that as well. So going back to the period of engagement, why did world history go through this upward part of the cycle? Between 1980 and 2010, the United States and China dealt with each other in constructive engagement. Whether they thought about it that way or not, that's what they did. So they ended up in inadvertent constructive engagement. The great driving themes of that era were two. There was geopolitics and there was international economics. Geopolitics said that the world was converging politically. Everyone would come to have soon the same political system. It's what my colleague Selena referred to as Hegel and Fukuyama's description of the end of history, that there was only one coherent political construct that all nations around the world, whatever region, geography, origins, would eventually converge to. This gave America great hope that as China grew, simply through the act of its maturing, China would become like them. There would be no ideological confrontation. There would be no geopolitical differences. Everyone would have the same politics. Economics was the mirror of that grand idea. Economics said that you should pursue economic efficiency and comparative advantage. China provided a cheap labor force, a willingness to industrialize that complemented what the rest of the world, America in particular, wanted. This gave rise to an interconnectedness, an inadvertent, cohesive, coalescent, global polity and economy. International trade is win-win. China's growth is win-win because of geopolitical convergence. But then something broke. We reached that peak. And that peak was not at China 80% of the United States. That peak happened in 2010, 2 years after the global financial crisis. Geopolitical attitudes shifted away from engagement towards rivalry. The world moved away from coalescence towards fragmentation. Some of that shift is ideological. China was showing no political convergence. As it grew, it remained firmly Marxist-Leninist. In fact, according to my colleague Selina, that is what drives China today. So the mistaken idea that many in the West had, that there would be geopolitical convergence, was frustrated and disappointed. And then, as an economist, for me, the China shock. The China shock was that China's economy became so powerful in manufacturing, so powerful in exports, that the rest of the world shook. And in America, what you saw were steel workers, auto manufacturing industry, looking around and saying, the price at which China is selling us steel, automobiles, the rest of what China exports, computers, textiles, everything you can mention, was low relative to everything else that America was making, everything else that America was importing from Canada or Mexico. That, for an economist, is the China shock. And what that gave rise to was a deep insecurity in America. When you price something lower than I can make it, you are taking business away from me. You are stealing my jobs. You are dismantling my industry. And through that, you are turning into ghost towns what were once thriving, middle-class American communities. Not only did China not converge politically, to the great disappointment of Frank Fukuyama, Seymour Martin Lipset, Bill Clinton, and a range of other thinkers, China was challenging America economically. And this challenge is not unique to America. In every society that produces goods that compete with China's, you are now all at risk. The right thing to do in that situation for an economist is to come along and say, don't worry, that means you're not very productive at making steel automobiles. I will teach you to program computers. In about 15 years, you will all be good computer programmers, and you will once again be able to compete with China. That is a story that no one bought. So the big China shock was this up and then down. The question is, what do we do going forwards? And this is where I end. The goal is obviously not to take each great power is just trying to do the best that it can. China wants to grow, and it should grow, to lift its people out of poverty. America doesn't want its people to feel insecure, and it shouldn't. We need to be able to come up with a way to triangulate that. So the question for us in the rest of the world is not to take sides, because everybody is right. The question is, what's the smart thing for us to do? So let me end with 3 smart things we can do. Remember I said the beginning of all this was inadvertent cooperation? We should go back to that. We should try and find domains of inadvertent cooperation. Let me give just 2. Okay? Inadvertent cooperation means you've got some goal in mind that's got nothing to do with what's going on here, but in pursuing that goal, you end up cooperating. Because now, given the tensions, full-blown cooperation is impossible. We can't go around telling the world, oh, please cooperate, because otherwise we're going to die. We're in a boat headed for an iceberg, we're all going to sink if you don't cooperate. That doesn't work. You've got to look for ways in which countries can, again, inadvertently cooperate. Here are 2. One is the global climate crisis. Every country in the world feels threatened by China's production of electric batteries, electric vehicles, and they want to put up industrial policy that will help their industry. Okay? Everybody in the world fears that when America practices industrial policy, there will be a retaliation, other countries will practice industrial policy. Let me say the thing that economists are not allowed to say. What's so bad about that? If America has industrial policy that makes it produce better batteries, better electric vehicles, move towards renewable energy, and in doing that, it makes Europe and China feel very uncomfortable, and they put on even more industrial policy to improve their batteries and electric vehicles, I say from the sidelines, right on. This is how we're going to save the world, through inadvertent cooperation. Two other ideas I have about small nations nudging the great powers out of gridlock. When you see two great powers banging away at each other, what you want to do is not necessarily get completely out of the way, but to nudge them away from gridlock. Convince them that they do not have to do this simply by making cooing, reassuring noises. And let me end by saying multilateralism, which was part of the idea that built the world in that inadvertent coalescence, is no longer on offer given the state of geopolitics. But a kind of pathfinder multilateralism will be available. This is hugely important for Singapore, hugely important that Singapore, which imports and exports 300% of GDP, again be able to engage on a level playing field with other nations in trade. If we can't do it for all of the world simultaneously, let's do it for subgroups. Let's do it for pathfinder multilateralism. So those are my ideas. Thank you very much for your attention. I'd now like to maybe engage with a few minutes with if there are burning points that each of my panelists wants to raise in confrontation with the others. If not, I'd like to then invite the audience to pose their questions to us. So I think there's unanimity here to get questions from the audience. Since, as Mr. Lee says, many of you are so experts in this. Yes, sir. Please come up to the microphone, say very quickly who you are, and then ask your question.
Just a quick one. My name is Ing. I've been looking at all these things and thinking about it. Just a couple of questions. Relative to the rest of the world, do you think the Chinese are over-competitive? And 46 years after Deng Xiaoping took charge of the failing Chinese economy, why haven't the Chinese produced leaders that can speak and engage with the rest of the world in English? I think that helps them project the soft power much better than just speaking Chinese.
Thank you very much for your question. Two very precise questions. If I may, let me just address them here in this panel. Mr. Lee, maybe you can take on the first question.
Yes, Ing, thanks for the question. I think the second question first, why can't they speak English? Actually, in my experience with those born after 70s, especially 70s and 80s, I see some of them rising in the hierarchy, speaking very good English. In fact, they study in the Western universities. So I have this hope that when they really become, at the top echelon one day, I think their worldview will be very different. So that is coming, akan datang. Your first question. What was the first question?
Chinese over-competitive.
Chinese over-competitive.
Well, there are many, we are all Chinese descent here, I mean, most of us. So we know we value education, you have Tiger Mum syndrome,
Tiger Mum.
You have tuition over the weekends, enrichment classes, and you work 18 hours a day, and you don't find it wrong, right? I mean, so it is very deep-rooted in the Chinese culture to value education. And that itself, when you have a system to organize the people in a productive way, you will produce lots of engineers and intelligentsia that will be needed to power the economy. So you can't say that, oh, please adopt the 8-to-5 rule, like Australia. If your bosses are not supposed to message you after what time, and the weekend and so on, you can't. It's not in the Chinese culture. So in that sense, that DNA is helpful, right? So I think, but of course, now there's an elephant in the room. If an elephant goes in the swimming pool, a lot of water will get spilled out, from the pool because of the sheer size. So I think this is something that they have to find ways to make the world feel, that they have a chance. So Chinese companies investing in other continents and creating jobs and sharing the benefits will be one productive way going forward.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. Heng Chi.
I want to go back to the question of Chinese speaking English and how it may affect soft power. I've been pondering that question myself. And I asked myself, why is it Indians in America do so well, and in Europe and Britain and so on? Of all the groups in the United States, the East Asian Americans don't do as well, and China doesn't do as well. Why? I think India has been under British colonialism for 250 years or more. They send their children to Britain, to the boarding schools. They set up boarding schools, Doon School, and whatever, St. Stephen's in Chennai, and so on, like Eton. And the Indian elite, Maharajas, all want to be British, join clubs, etc. So they know the culture, and they're used to talking to foreigners. China has never been colonized, really, except in the concessions on the coast. And when you had the Mongols who came and the Manchus who came, the Qing dynasty became Chinese, the Mongols stuck to themselves, hired other people to run the country for them. So the Chinese are very, in a sense, their culture has not been diluted. They can't understand, the West in that way. So you can learn English. They go to the colleges, but they learn science mainly, maths, and there's no cultural content there. I was always asked in the United States, Ambassador Chan, why do the Chinese point their fingers at us, wave their finger at us all the time when they speak? The West finds it very aggressive. I say, oh, it's like the Italians, they shake their hands. And the Chinese just point themselves. It's not personal. They point at each other too, and even family members. But there's a cultural clash there. And I really think it's the fact that China has not been colonized in that way, and the colonization was very different. I think that's why they've not. Today, because the world is Western hegemonism for so long, that you've got to understand part of that culture.
Thank you, Heng Chi. Can I just pick up on this as well? Here in Singapore, people too had initially challenges with engaging with the English-speaking world. There were attempts to stamp out Singlish, that dialects were not considered appropriate, and then there was a big push to get English. And so now we've articulate English speakers. And China could well do that. And indeed, in the number of people that China has sent to the United States and to the UK, Western Europe, it's developing a whole new generation of people. My friend Ke Yu-jin, people like Eric Lee and others who are just as articulate and persuasive in English as they are in Chinese. Or maybe I just pick up your point about whether Chinese are over-competitive. I think the right question is, why is the system that we have built so fragile that a group that's a little bit more competitive then ends up being viewed as disruptive for the rest of the system? We should be thinking about how we build systems so that more competition, as much competition as anyone can bring out, is good for the system. And ideally, we can think about ways like that. This is what Adam Smith was about. Adam Smith said 200 years ago, it is not because we think people are nice to each other, that they are benevolent, that we expect dinner on our table, but instead it's from the butcher, baker, and the brewer they're paying attention to their self-interest that guarantees the delivery in the economic marketplace. And we need to be building systems like that. Sir, may I? Yeah, please. And then after that, yourself.
Thank you, Danny. Zainal here. I must say that, first of all, I'd like to thank Lee Kuan Yew School for this festival. Today is our former Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew's birthday, and it's 101 years old. And I personally owe a lot to him, and Singapore owes a lot to him. And in particular, in our understanding of China, I think in the opening of China and the trips, at that time I was editor of Berita Harian, Malay newspaper, but Mr. Lee Kuan Yew always make it a point that when we go to China, it's always a multiracial kind of composition of delegation, including editors who go along. So I was privileged and honored to be part of that team. But I also like to emphasize to Mr. Lee that we are not all Chinese here. I'm one of those Singaporean, but not all Chinese. But I think the point I want to make is that I just came back from Xinjiang. I was there for 2 weeks, and we went with my former classmates, school classmates, and they chose to visit Xinjiang because of the Muslim background. And I wanted to ask a question about how do you see China responding to the challenges which you all discuss about, in particular America, but with the role of the in that context? Do you see China turning to that part of the Muslim world to bring about a better understanding, better relationships with the rest of the world? But having said that, I would like also to ask another question about Singapore's role. What I heard just now, really fantastic, fabulous ideas. China was wondering why Singapore is 70% Chinese, should be more Chinese rather than closer to America. But we see our Singapore as multiracial and closer to the realities of the challenges of the world. How do you see Singapore's role in that context? Can Singapore play a role in making China understand the world better? And the final point about learning Chinese, learning English, I also had the same sentiment when I was there. I had difficulties communicating. But then I asked myself, why not I learn Mandarin? Of course, China must learn English too, and learn the other cultures of the world. But I think we, the non-Chinese, also can learn and understand China better. Thank you.
Thank you, Zainal. Thank you. Yeah, let's take some other questions. Well, please. Do you want to? Is there a microphone? Can we bring one here very quickly so everybody else can hear? I hear you fine, so but everybody else wants to hear you as well.
So I just want to offer a comment here, because the AI technology progress has been so rapid. Today, it's beginning to happen. You can speak in any language.
Yes.
Simultaneously be translated to multiple languages. So people who want to translate into Malay sit one side, and African another side. And if you respond, same thing, you can respond in any language, you'll be translated into whatever language the speaker.
Thank you.
So the day is coming. So that's the good news.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Sir, please, question. Okay. All right. I'm going to get Nishan.
My name is Puneet Oza, and thank you so much for this event. I really enjoyed the conversations. I'm a student as well as a teacher of geopolitics and shipping, because that's my profession. So obviously this is very interesting. I just wanted the view from all of you on a particular point of view which has been promulgated, at least in some of the Chinese friends and other friends I have, who say that the challenge with China, what is happening today, is more because of the confusion, which is because there are two systems in one country. There is a centralized decision-making planned economy system. At the same time, there's a lot of private initiative which is driving the growth and potential growth. When both of these collide at one point of time, the confusion is basically creating a biggest challenge for China going forward. Is that view correct from all of you?
Thank you very much. Li Xin, can I just get your question in before I turn to the panel?
Thanks, Danny. This is Li Xin. A quick question, especially after Yuxian mentioned the Chinese company are all going out or you're going to die. And they are coming out to ASEAN for two reasons. One is to better access the market, not just the ASEAN market, but also the European and the US market, which turns out to be more restrictive. And another is, to some extent, bypass the export control that the US is implementing on China. So will that translate into more pressure on countries like Singapore from US that to stop helping China to get access to the export control restricted technology, for instance, the computer chips and that?
Thank you very much, Li Xin. Mr. Lee, may I begin with you again? We've got a lot of questions, so just pick and choose, however you like.
Li Xin's question, right? Will Singapore stop helping China? I think I think the companies are making adjustments based on the existing arrangements under WTO, under bilateral and multilateral free trade agreements. So they will figure out a way. If the direct export is tariffs too high, they'll go to a different country and then, and benefiting the shipping lines and so on, and find the path of minimum least resistance. They will go. So if this tariffs structure change again, then I think companies will have to adjust again. So it's not so much whether Singapore will or will not help these companies. We just make ourselves as business friendly as possible to receive any businesses that can make use of Singapore, to prosper. I think coming to the questions on the balance between the role of central government and the enterprise. Indeed, it's true. It's a common observation that in the last 10, 12 years, there is this phenomenon called 国进民退, meaning SOE advance, but POEs retreat. Okay, so SOE advance and POEs retreat. So meaning that the private sector role is getting smaller. At least the sentiment is felt that way, right? That a lot of important major needle-moving projects are to be done by SOEs. But having said that, there's qualification because a lot of the EV manufacturers today, they are POEs, right? But the Chinese government has wanted to always play a bigger role in telling you what to do. Right? So that is quite contrary to what we are used to in the Western world and in Singapore. We believe that the government should do only this and then let the market thrive, right? And exercise their judgment and initiatives. So I think indeed that is a sentiment today, and that sentiment doesn't inspire confidence for continual investments.
Heng Chi, may I invite you to speak to?
I think I'll take Zainal's question because you've picked up the others. And it's the question of how China will deal with the Middle East, and because it wants to reach out and establish some influence and cooperation there. And certainly is one way of breaking out of what they see as the West, United States, leading its NATO allies to try to circumscribe China. And it's got this Xinjiang problem and how they would deal with the Muslims. In fact, I have asked before a Chinese official, why did China not seek advice from, I didn't say Singapore, Malaysia or Indonesia, which are Muslim majority countries, how they deal with radical Islam, And I said, it's still possible, it may not be too late. I didn't get an answer because I think it was above his pay grade. But I think China will have to resolve that. So far, as you know, OIC has been quite silent. Saudi Arabia, the Middle East countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, they've not made an issue of what is happening in Xinjiang, mainly because it is separatist. This was explained to me. because it is a separatist faction, and most of these countries are against separatism themselves. But I think China, for its own self-esteem and for its ability to reach out further to the rest of the world, will have to resolve the Xinjiang question. I don't think it's genocide. I think it's human rights abuses, grave human rights abuses. So it's a question of how China seeks to deal with that issue, because otherwise it will always be something that stands in the way of full cooperation.
Thank you, Heng-Chi. Selena?
Yeah, let me maybe answer. I'll leave the business and econ question to both of you on my right, left and right. I'll answer Zaino's question, which is in addition to what Ambassador Chan has said, which is, I think there is this rich, this public relations outreach, public outreach that China is doing to Muslim countries in terms of the situation in Xinjiang. So they have, invited religious leaders and Muslim groups in Indonesia and Malaysia as well to visit Xinjiang and to show, that all these things are not happening. But I think one thing we have to, if we step back a little bit more, there is something else involved here. This improving our relations with the Muslim world, I think that's something we want to do. But we know that China's relations with Indonesia and Malaysia is actually quite good, especially in the economic realm. And that has a lot to do with that as well. So there is this foreign policy part that is slightly separate from the religious issue. And I think China's involvement in the Middle East is not just about religion. There is that great power management, which I was talking about. That great powers manage the world. What does it mean to manage the world? Meaning that you insert yourself into places where there are conflicts and where there's violence. And then you play a mediating role. And I think in its rise to global prominence, and it's part of its global ambitions, has inserted itself in the Middle East in the way that the United States have, and in places that the United States have not been able to broker a deal, like between Iran and Saudi Arabia earlier on and all that. So it has inserted itself in great power management, taking on the role of great power, filling spaces that the US cannot fill. I think that's an important thing to remember about this outreach to the Muslim world and to the Middle East. Singapore's, because we're out of time. Singapore's role in making China understand the world better. I think that we have played a role in this for a very long time in terms of translation, in terms of trying to bridge, being the meeting points for. But I think that role in this current climate is still there, but it may not be as it was in the past. In the past, China was willing to learn. It was a student. It was the student during Deng Xiaoping's time. It is now the teacher. I think it considers itself to be a teacher. I think we need to remember that, and we should be careful about how we approach this issue and the kind of role that we play. Yep.
Thank you, Selena. Heng-Chi, you wanted to jump in?
I just wanted to add, I didn't answer that point. I agree with Selena that China has, in fact, developed, it's grown, it's got. At the time when they were reaching out and the West was talking to China, they had a lot of dialogue set up, hundreds of dialogues. They didn't need Singapore. But I think this moment, when China is having so much difficulties with the West and trying to get the West to understand and appreciate what it is trying to do, there is a role for Singapore. I know it because Chinese groups, think tanks have come to Singapore and said, can you help to create some dialogue between the United States and China? Because Singapore is in fact trusted by the US and you have channels in China. So I do not dismiss our role now, but we should be at least modest and humble about how much effect we can have. It's always good to try to help establish dialogue because the two sides can talk to each other. And now and again, though Singapore is seen to be pro-West, I think even by China, they understand that Singapore leaders do now and again at important forums speak out for China to urge that the West, sort of also speak to China. I remember Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, when he was Prime Minister, said at the Nikkei Forum, he said, I understand that there are groupings that are going to be formed of like-minded people to deal with future challenges, referring to all these minilaterals the United States was forming in the region. He said, but do you, in fact, build confidence-building measures with your potential adversary? It's that kind of statement that I think China will find helpful.
Thank you, Heng Chi. If I may, I'll just say a couple of words on Li Xian's question, but maybe in a slightly different direction. I think one of the things that is a great pitfall for the rest of us is to think that in this US-China confrontation, we can just jump in and do business. We can be, the China plus one, so that when America gets really tired of China, it turns to us as the plus one. I want to just take the view that if you think that America's problem with China is nothing personal, the challenges that it faces with the China shock, China's exports, is not unique to China. It is just something that it's going to react to every time it sees a competitive economy that's exporting to America in a way that challenges America's supremacy. We saw that with Japan. Japan in the 1990s and 2000s was enemy number one for the United States economic policy, trade policy. And Japan at that time was no China. Japan was firmly an ally of the US-Pacific Alliance. Japan's entire military was undergirded by the US Department of Defense. Nonetheless, America felt that Japan's exporting prowess in refrigerators, in automobiles, in consumer electronics presented a threat to the American economy. So if any of us think that, China and US are in trouble, I can be a Vietnam, I can be a Mexico, I can be somebody else that comes in and takes over from what China exported to the US, I can be the plus one. Well, my worry is that economics tells us we're not going to be. We need to play another strategy, one that's more constructive, that helps bring America and China together again. I would love to have more questions because it's been so much fun. I hope it's been fun for everyone, but we've reached the end of our time. It only remains for me to invite you to join me in thanking this wonderful panel.
Thank you, panelists. May we now invite them to the front for a group photography, please? In the meantime, we'd like to thank all of you for attending this festival session, and the next lobby session will begin at 12:15 p.m. In the meantime, please feel free to explore around the BTC campus and participate in some of our fringe activities that we have for you. These ranges from our research to heritage exhibitions to our amazing race, where 20 lucky individuals will stand to win $120 worth of prizes. We hope you're hungry as well because we have food stations popping up at our student lounge, which is right at the back. So if you would like to, you can visit there for some food and beverages as well. Thank you.